So now that we've gone over how to find the slope from a graph, we just went over that on the previous video, now we're going to finish it up and go over how do you find the slope from 2 points, which means you have no graph. So you can always go ahead and graph them, but that requires you to graph them. There's actually an algebraic way, meaning without using a picture, although you can always graph it, but that would mean you'd have to draw a nice graph to make sure the counting works out. So let's say we don't want to have to draw a graph and graph the 2 points and then connect them and then do the counting. We can go ahead and find the slope from 2 points. So first, before we get to that, we're going to ask ourselves, what is the connection between the slope and the points themselves? So there is a connection, and this is going to be the algebraic method, meaning without using the graph. So let's look at the first one. So earlier we got that the first one was 7 divided by 4 for our slope. So let's go ahead and look at our coordinates. And we're going to look at our coordinates and decide what is the connection between our coordinates and our slope right here. So looking at the slope right here and the 2 individual coordinates. So I know that the 7 over 4 comes from the 2 points, so it has to come from those numbers. So let's look at the number 7, which is the rise. Rise means up and down. So if I'm looking at the rise, I'm looking at the y values. So if I look at these 2 y values, what would I have to do to these 2 y values in order to get a positive 7? If I add them, I'm going to get -1, but if I subtract them, I'm going to get -7. So subtracting seems to be a little closer than adding. Let's look at the y values now. The x values. Let's look at the x values of 2 and the -2. How are these numbers connected to my 4 from the run, which is across x value? So if I add these numbers, I'm going to get 0, but if I subtract these numbers, I'm going to get -4. So they both come out to the numbers I want, but the wrong sign, which means if I divide them, they're going to cancel out. So there it is. It's pretty much subtracting the x coordinates and the y coordinates in the correct order. So let's go ahead and write down the formula. You may have seen it in the past, but here it is again in case it looks familiar. So we want to find the slope through any 2 points. We use the following formula. We subtract the y values of the points, and then we subtract the x values of the points. So you may be wondering, what do those little 1s and 2s mean? All the 1s and 2s mean on this equation, it just means the first x and the first y and the second x and the second y. You have 2 different points, so we have to be able to distinguish them. So when you subtract them, you have to do it in the same order. So let's go ahead and write down that formula into our notes. So go ahead and write down m equals y2 minus y1 all over x to the base of 2 minus x1. So this is our formula that we're going to be using to find slope. It's just subtracting 2 numbers in a fraction form and then sometimes reducing it, sometimes not needing to reduce it. So let's go ahead and do the first one on our paper. So we're going to go ahead and find that the slope is 7/4 without having to use the graph itself. So I know that in this first problem, I have 2, 3, and I have -2, -4. So when I subtract these, I have to make sure I go in the same order both times. So when I do that, I'm going to make sure I remember to go in the same order both times. So I'm going to start with the first y value, which is 3. Put 3. I'm going to subtract. And then I'm going to remember to write down my second number, not put 4. I need to put -4. So very common mistake is to forget the subtraction and just put 3 minus 4, and not even think about that. I'm supposed to be subtracting when there's a negative, so it's a double negative. Same thing for the y values. I'm going to take my 2, and I'm going to subtract whatever's down here, which is a -2. So there's a double negative here as well. Well, I know when I have a double negative, I can just switch it to positives, which gives me 7/4. This slope is the same slope we had previously when we did it with the graph only. So this is how we find slope. Let's go ahead and try it again for the second and third problem. So here's the next problem. Give it a second. There it is. We're going to go ahead and subtract our points. Something I find that's helpful is to write my fraction first and the two subtractions, then fill in the numbers. And that usually helps sometimes not to forget to put the double negative if it's needed. So I'm going to go ahead and start with my first y value. Remember, we start with the y value. It's -1. Look at my other y value, -2. Put parentheses around it. Then go to my x's. My first x value, I have to go back to the left, -3, and get my second x value, which is 4. Then I go ahead and I can simplify that double negative. So I have 2 minus 1 is 1. -3 minus 4. Add negatives, they stay negative. So we get -1/7. You can also rewrite this as, and I'll write it up here, or at the top since it doesn't fit here, -1/7. So the negative in the bottom of the denominator is the same thing as it being in the middle or the top. They all represent the same thing. Let's move on to the last example. So in the last example, we should get the same answer as before, so let's go ahead and set up our problem. And that's the wrong slide. That's an accident. Let's go back. Give me 1 second. Sorry, having technical difficulties here. Is that the last one? Here we go. So give it 1 second to load. There it is. So first thing is I'm going to go ahead and set up my fraction. Put my little subtraction signs. Now I'm going to fill in the numbers. I'm going to start off with my first y value, which is the 4. And I'm going to subtract the other y value, which is -1. Get my x value, -1. Subtract -2. So notice I'm making sure I do my subtractions and my negatives. So again, double negatives become positives. So that's going to give me 5. Double negatives gives me a positive. Those are going to subtract and give me +1. 5 divided by 1 is equal to 5. So it looks like I got the same slope as before. So just to end the notes now, just a quick summary of what is slope all about and the whole purpose of it. So mathematicians developed a useful measure of steepness of a line. They called it slope. Slope compares the vertical change, which is the rise, with the horizontal change, which is the run, when moving from one point to another. So it's pretty much a ratio comparing the changes in both directions, and that's how we calculate slope. So now go ahead and work on your practice pages. Good luck.